My father kicked me out on Christmas Eve to appease his new fiancée, demanding I leave their lives. So I walked away, pulled my funding, and watched their dream house collapse, leaving them drowning in debt they never saw coming. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The fever had been building behind my eyes since Tuesday. A heavy, throbbing pressure that made the colorful lights of the Christmas tree in the corner of the living room blur into sharp, painful starbursts. I was 34 years old, but shivering there on my father's expensive leather sofa, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, I felt remarkably small. I was fighting off a severe bronchial infection, my chest rattling with every breath. I had spent the last 3 days dragging myself through the house, trying to ensure everything was perfect for the holidays. I had baked the pies my father, Wesley, always loved. I had wrapped the gifts. I had polished the silver. I was exhausted, physically depleted, and entirely vulnerable. I was waiting for Wesley to return from what was supposed to be a quick trip to the specialty grocer downtown. He had been gone for nearly 4 hours. When my phone finally buzzed on the coffee table, vibrating against the mahogany wood, the screen illuminated with his name. I coughed, a harsh, scraping sound in the quiet house, and reached out from beneath the heavy wool blanket to answer it. "Dad," I said, my voice barely more than a ragged whisper. "Are you on your way back? The snow is starting to come down pretty hard, and the roads are going to freeze over soon." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, ambient noise of a restaurant in the background, the clinking of silverware, the soft murmur of voices, and the unmistakable, high-pitched laugh of Brenda. My stomach tightened. "Sophia," Wesley finally said. His voice was completely devoid of the warmth that usually accompanied his greetings. It was flat, clinical, and rehearsed. It was the tone of a man reading a script he had memorized but didn't fully understand. "I'm not coming back to the house right now. Brenda and I are having dinner." "Dinner?" I asked, confused, pressing the phone closer to my ear. "But it's Christmas Eve. We always have dinner here. I made the roast." I set the table. "Sophia, listen to me," he interrupted, his tone hardening, shutting down my confusion with a wall of ice. "Brenda and I have been talking for a long time this afternoon. We've been discussing our future and the new house and how things need to change moving forward." I sat up slowly, the blanket falling away from my shoulders. The chill in the room suddenly felt entirely disconnected from the winter weather outside. "What are you talking about, Dad?" "We need a fresh start," Wesley said, his words crisp and detached. "A completely clean slate. Brenda feels, and I agree, that your presence in my life is overbearing. You manage too much. You control too much. We are starting a new life together in the new house, and we cannot have you casting a shadow over our marriage." My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't process the words. "Casting a shadow?" I whispered. "Dad, I'm your daughter. I've taken care of you for 5 years." "You've smothered me for 5 years," he corrected coldly, and I could hear Brenda whispering something unintelligible in the background. Wesley cleared his throat and delivered the final, devastating blow. "We think it's best if you stop being part of our lives. I'll move forward on my own. I want you out of the house by tonight. Leave the keys on the counter. Brenda is bringing some of her family over tomorrow morning, and we need the space." The silence that followed was absolute. It rushed into my ears, drowning out the crackle of the fireplace. I stared at the Christmas tree, at the ornaments I had carefully hung just 2 days ago. He was kicking me out on Christmas Eve, while I was sick. After everything I had done, every sacrifice I had made to keep him afloat, he was throwing me away to appease a woman he had known for barely half a year. I felt a tear slide down my feverish cheek, but I refused to let him hear me cry. I drew in a long, shaky breath, summoning every ounce of professional stoicism I possessed as a financial underwriter. I buried the devastation deep down in my chest and locked it away. "If that's your decision," I replied, my voice miraculously steady, "I'll respect it." "Good," Wesley said briskly, sounding relieved that I wasn't fighting him. I'll send you the address for where to forward my mail once we officially close on the new property next week. Goodbye, Sophia." The line went dead. I lowered the phone, staring at the black screen. The coldness in his voice was a sharper blow than the winter wind. The betrayal was worse than the illness ravaging my lungs. The next 3 hours were a blur of agonizing physical exertion and profound emotional numbness. I dragged 2 large suitcases from the hall closet and began emptying my life into them. My chest burned with every trip up and down the stairs. I didn't pack everything, just the essentials: my clothes, my laptop, my most important documents. I left behind the furniture I had bought for the house, the artwork I had framed for him. I didn't want any of it. As I zipped the second suitcase closed, my phone rang again. It was Adeline, my closest friend and a senior colleague at the firm. I had texted her a brief, panicked message an hour earlier, asking if I could crash at her apartment because of a family emergency. "Sophia, I'm outside in the driveway," Adeline's voice crackled through the speaker, tight with concern and rage. "The roads are terrible. Grab your things. What the hell is going on? Your text made no sense." I grabbed my heavy winter coat, wincing as a coughing fit seized me. "I'm coming out." "He kicked me out, Adeline. He told me to leave." When I pushed through the front door into the biting cold, dragging my bags through the accumulating snow, Adeline rushed out of her idling SUV to help me. She took one look at my pale, fever-flushed face and swore loudly under her breath. She hoisted my bags into the trunk while I climbed into the passenger seat, wrapping my arms around my shivering torso. "What do you mean he kicked you out?" Adeline demanded as she put the car in reverse, the tires crunching loudly over the icy driveway. "It's Christmas Eve. You're sick. Did you guys get into a fight?" "No," I rasped, staring out the window at the house I had maintained for half a decade, watching it fade into the dark, snowy night. "There was no fight. He just called me from a restaurant. He was with Brenda. He said I was overbearing. He said they need a clean slate and that I'm not to be part of their lives anymore." Adeline gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. "That arrogant, ungrateful old man," she hissed. "After everything you've done for him, after you practically gave up your late 20s to nurse him through his depression. And who the hell does Brenda think she is?" "She thinks she's his future," I murmured, closing my eyes as a wave of exhaustion washed over me. We drove in silence for a long time, the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers the only sound in the car. As we neared Adeline's apartment building, my phone chimed with an incoming text message. I opened my eyes and looked at the bright screen. It was from Wesley. "Make sure you leave both sets of spare keys on the kitchen island. Brenda's sister is taking your old room, and we need to get in early tomorrow to start painting. Do not contact me regarding the new house purchase. My lawyer will handle the closing on Tuesday without you. We are having your name pulled from the documentation tomorrow morning." I stared at the text. I read it twice. And then, despite the fever, despite the crushing weight of the betrayal, a strange, hollow sensation began to bloom in my chest. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was the cold, calculating clarity of a financial underwriter looking at a fatally flawed spreadsheet. He was having my name pulled from the documentation. He thought it was just a symbolic gesture, a way to erase my presence from his shiny new life. He wanted independence. He wanted to look like the wealthy, capable patriarch in front of Brenda. I locked my phone and rested my head against the cold glass of the passenger window. They wanted me out of the picture. I would give them exactly what they asked for. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. Without my name on that specific documentation, the entire foundation of their perfect new life was destined to collapse. To understand the magnitude of what was happening, you have to understand the past 5 years. When my mother passed away suddenly from an aneurysm, Wesley completely fell apart. He was a retired structural engineer, a man who had spent his life building bridges and commercial high-rises, but without my mother, his own structural integrity crumbled. He stopped paying bills. He stopped maintaining the house. He nearly lost his pension due to a series of incredibly reckless financial decisions made in the fog of his grief. I was 29 at the time, just beginning to make a serious name for myself in the corporate underwriting world. but I put my life on hold. I moved back into my childhood home. I took over his finances, organized his debts, and slowly pulled him back from the brink of total ruin. I set up a strict budget. I managed his investments. I became the parent, and he became the dependent. I didn't mind it. I loved him. He was my father, and I was all he had left. Or so I thought, until Brenda walked into a local charity gala 6 months ago and set her sights on him. Brenda was 42, though she claimed to be 39. She introduced herself as a high-end art consultant and gallery curator, a title that sounded incredibly impressive until you realized she had no actual gallery, no verifiable clients, and her primary source of income seemed to be the wealthy, older men she dated. She was immaculately polished, designer clothes, perfect hair, and aggressive perfume that lingered in a room long after she left it. From the very first time Wesley brought her to the house for dinner, I knew exactly what she was. I remember sitting across from her at the dining room table. She spent the first 20 minutes complimenting the crown molding, but her eyes were constantly cataloging the value of the room. "Wesley tells me you're a financial underwriter, Sophia," Brenda had said, swirling her wine glass, her manicured nails tapping against the crystal. "That sounds so stressful, dealing with all that money. And you manage Wesley's estate as well. That must be a heavy burden for a young woman." "It's not a burden," I had replied evenly. "It's family." Brenda offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, he's so lucky to have you. But a man like Wesley, he needs to spread his wings, don't you think? He shouldn't be tied down by the past." Over the next few months, Brenda systematically isolated him. She complained that my budget was too restrictive, that I was treating him like a child. She convinced him that he needed a new home, a grand estate where they could entertain her high society friends. She found a massive, sprawling property in the wealthiest suburb of the city, a house that was easily 4 times what Wesley could comfortably afford on his fixed income. When the mortgage brokers balked at his debt-to-income ratio, Wesley had come to me, panicked and desperate, begging for my help. He told me Brenda would leave him if they didn't get the house. Out of blind, foolish love, I had stepped in. I didn't just co-sign, I leveraged my own immaculate credit. I restructured the financing through a private portfolio lender I worked with professionally. And most importantly, I put down the mandatory $150,000 earnest money deposit directly from my own private trust account, money I had spent a decade saving. I had structured the purchase contract meticulously, as any underwriter would. I built in strict contingencies to protect my investment. And now, sitting in Adeline's spare bedroom as the clock struck midnight on Christmas Eve, I realized Brenda hadn't just wanted a new house. She wanted total control of Wesley's assets, and she viewed me as the only obstacle standing in her way. She had convinced him to cut me out, assuming the financing for the house was locked in and that my $150,000 was now legally bound to the property, essentially a gift. She was an art consultant. She knew how to make things look beautiful on the surface. But I was an underwriter. I knew how to read the fine print. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled up my contacts. I found the number for Nolan, my personal real estate attorney. I drafted a message, my eyes burning with fever and a cold, resolute fury. "Nolan, Merry Christmas. I need you to execute the termination clause on the Westfield property first thing Tuesday morning. They are pulling my name from the documentation. Let the financing collapse." Christmas morning broke with a pale, anemic light that filtered through the blinds of Adeline's guest bedroom. I woke up with my chest still tight, but the burning fever that had consumed me the night before had finally broken, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. I sat up, pulling the heavy quilt around my shoulders, and reached for my phone. It was 7 in the morning. There was a message waiting for me from Nolan. Nolan wasn't just a real estate attorney. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who possessed a terrifying attention to detail and a profound distaste for people who tried to exploit his clients. Message received, his text read, "I am pulling the contract file now. If they formally submitted the request to remove you as the primary guarantor, the automated system at the brokerage will flag it immediately. I am drafting the termination notice to the sellers. Merry Christmas, Sophia. Let's go to work. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension in my jaw release just a fraction. This was the turning point. The victim they had envisioned, the weeping, discarded daughter, was gone. In her place was the financial underwriter who had single-handedly built the walls they were currently trying to tear down. I walked into the kitchen, where Adeline was already sitting at the island, 2 steaming mugs of black coffee resting on the granite counter. She had her laptop open, the screen glowing brightly in the dim kitchen. "How are you feeling?" she asked, handing me a mug. "Like I've been hit by a truck," I replied, taking a slow sip of the bitter coffee. "But my mind is clear. They are officially pulling my name from the documentation today. They think it's just a matter of erasing me off the title." Adeline let out a short, humorless laugh. "They really don't understand what you do for a living, do they?" "Wesley never paid attention to the mechanics of it," I explained, pulling a stool out and sitting beside her. "He just liked the results. When I set up the financing for that massive house, I knew it was a terrible financial decision for him. So I protected myself and I tried to protect him. I didn't use a standard mortgage template. I used a specialized portfolio structure. The entire purchase, including the loan approval and the seller's agreement to take the house off the market, was contingent on my specific financial profile." I leaned forward, tapping my finger against the marble counter for emphasis. "More importantly, the earnest money, the $150,000 sitting in escrow, came directly from my private trust. The contract explicitly states that if my name is removed from the buying party by the primary applicant, the financing is instantly nullified. The contract is breached, the earnest money defaults back to my trust, and the remaining buyers are entirely responsible for the financial penalties of the broken contract." Adeline stared at me, her eyes widening in realization. "You built a trap door." "I built a safety net," I corrected softly. "But if they choose to cut the ropes, it becomes a trap, and they just handed me the scissors." "Then let's see exactly who we are dealing with," Adeline said, turning her laptop toward me. I couldn't sleep, so I started doing some digging into Brenda's high-end art consultant business. "Sophia, there is no gallery. There is no LLC registered in this state or any neighboring state under her name." For the next 4 hours, we transformed her kitchen island into a war room. We bypassed the standard search engines and dug into public court registries, property tax records, and civil dockets. What we found was a staggering, methodical history of deception. Brenda wasn't an art consultant. She was a highly efficient parasite. We found 2 separate bankruptcies filed in different states under slightly altered middle names. We found civil judgments for unpaid rent on luxury apartments. But the most damning piece of leverage was a heavily documented civil suit from 3 years prior in Arizona. An elderly widower had sued her for fraud after she systematically drained his retirement accounts, while claiming she was investing the funds into non-existent contemporary art. "She settles out of court right before it goes to trial," Adeline muttered, scrolling through the dense legal jargon of the docket. "She bleeds them dry, pushes them to the brink, and then vanishes before a judge can formally convict her. And now she's doing it to Wesley." "Not anymore," I said, closing my eyes as a fresh wave of adrenaline washed over me. "Not this time." The fallout happened exactly when Nolan predicted it would. By late afternoon, the winter sky had darkened, and the snow was piling heavily against the windows. I had spent the afternoon resting, drinking water, and compiling a digital dossier of every piece of evidence Adeline and I had uncovered. I was sitting on the sofa, staring at the television without really seeing it, when my phone screen lit up. It was a text message from a number I didn't recognize, but the signature told me everything I needed to know. It was Wesley's attorney, a man named David, whom Brenda had recently hired to replace Nolan. "Sophia," the text read, "we are facing a serious legal and financial problem regarding the property closing. Your father's earnest money has been frozen, and the sellers are threatening immediate legal action for breach of contract. Please answer your phone. I exited the text thread and looked at my call log. In the span of my short afternoon nap, I had accumulated 36 missed calls, 36 frantic, desperate attempts to reach me. The silence of my phone had finally been broken. Just as I read the text, the phone began to vibrate in my hand again. It was Wesley's number. I took a deep breath, centered my emotions, and pressed answer. "Hello," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "Sophia." "What the hell have you done?" It was Wesley. It was Brenda. Her voice, usually so carefully modulated and dripping with artificial sweetness, was shrill, bordering on hysterical. The polished facade had completely cracked. "I haven't done anything, Brenda," I replied, keeping my tone entirely conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "I simply respected my father's wishes. I packed my things and I left." "You canceled the financing." She shrieked, the sound echoing harshly through the speaker. "David just called us. The escrow account is empty. The bank is saying the loan is dead and the sellers are keeping the house and suing us for damages. You need to call your bank right now and fix this banking error. Right now, Sophia, or I swear to God I will have you arrested for grand larceny." I let her scream. I listened to her heavy, panicked breathing on the other end of the line. I didn't interrupt her poorly executed threats. I let her expose her desperation. "There is no banking error, Brenda," I said slowly, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. "The earnest money was mine. It was wired from my trust. When Wesley, under your brilliant guidance, submitted the paperwork to sever me from the contract this morning, the contingencies I authored were triggered. The contract is breached. The money reverted to my account. I am no longer legally or financially associated with that property." "You little brat," she hissed, her voice trembling with absolute fury. "You planned this. You set us up. Wesley is your father. You're ruining his dream." "No, Brenda," I countered, my voice dropping an octave, cold and unyielding. "I was protecting his reality. Just like I'm sure that gentleman in Arizona wished someone had protected his reality 3 years ago. What was his name again? Arthur. Richard. The one whose retirement you funneled into your imaginary art gallery before he took you to civil court." The silence on the line was instantaneous. It was profound. For 5 long seconds, there wasn't a single sound from her end. The shrill aggression vanished, replaced by the terrified silence of a cornered animal realizing the hunter knew exactly where it was hiding. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, the lie so incredibly obvious it was almost pathetic. "You're crazy. You're making things up because you're jealous." "I have the court dockets, Brenda," I stated simply. "I have the bankruptcy filings from Nevada." "I know exactly what you are. You wanted me out of the picture because you thought I was a naive daughter you could easily push aside. But I'm an underwriter. My entire career is built on finding the hidden risks, and you are the biggest, most obvious liability I have ever seen." She hung up on me. 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, when I answered, it was Wesley. "Sophia," he began, his voice shaking. It wasn't the cold, authoritative tone from Christmas Eve. It was the voice of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the jagged rocks below. "What is going on?" "Brenda is in the bedroom crying hysterically. She says you threatened her. She says you're trying to destroy the house purchase out of spite." I closed my eyes, a sharp pang of sorrow cutting through my anger. He was still defending her. Even as the walls were collapsing around him, his loyalty was completely misplaced. "Dad, listen to me very carefully," I said, refusing to raise my voice. "I didn't destroy the purchase. The contract clearly stated that my financial backing was contingent on my involvement. You told me to leave. You told me you wanted a clean slate. I gave you exactly what you asked for. The consequences of that decision belong entirely to you and your lawyer. But the sellers are threatening to sue me." He shouted, panic bleeding into his words. "They want $50,000 in damages for taking the house off the market. I don't have that kind of money liquid, Sophia. You handle my accounts, you know that. You need to release the earnest money back into escrow immediately." "I am no longer your financial manager, Dad. Remember, I was too overbearing." "Don't do this to me, Sophia," he pleaded, his voice cracking. Brenda is a good woman. She explained that nonsense you brought up about Arizona. It was a misunderstanding with an abusive ex-partner. She was a victim. How dare you hire investigators to look into her past? You're paranoid. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles ached. The extent of her manipulation was breathtaking. She had already spun a web of lies to cover the Arizona lawsuit, playing the victim to secure his sympathy. She was escalating her deception, desperately trying to maintain her hold on him. I didn't hire an investigator, Dad. It's public record, I said, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. And she wasn't a victim. She was the defendant in a massive civil fraud case. I don't believe you, he snapped, his fear manifesting as anger. You've always hated her because she makes me happy. At that moment, my email chimed. It was Nalan. He had forwarded a comprehensive, legally certified file containing every piece of evidence we had requested, beautifully formatted and impossible to dispute. It wasn't just a list of accusations, it was sworn affidavits, bank records, and legal judgments. You don't have to believe me over the phone, I told him, staring at the email attachment. But you are going to have to face the reality of your situation. You are currently facing a massive lawsuit from the sellers, and your fiancé is a serial grifter with a documented history of financial elder abuse. Stop it, Wesley yelled. I will only discuss this further in a professional setting, I continued, ignoring his outburst. If you want to understand how to navigate the legal disaster you are currently in, you and Brenda will meet me at Nolan's office tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. Bring your lawyer, David. Bring whoever you want. But if you don't show up, I will block your number, and you can face the breach of contract lawsuit entirely on your own. You are my daughter, he said, a desperate final attempt to use guilt as leverage. And yesterday, you told me you wanted to move forward on your own, I reminded him. I'll see you tomorrow at 9, Dad. Don't be late. I ended the call and let the phone drop onto the sofa. The first 2 phases of the battle were over. I had survived the ambush, and I had set the trap. Tomorrow morning, under the fluorescent lights of a legal boardroom, I was going to spring it. Tuesday morning was bitterly cold, the kind of deep, biting frost that seemed to seep through the soles of your shoes and settle directly into your bones. I stood in the lobby of Nolan's law firm, a sprawling suite on the 42nd floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper downtown, and watched the city below wake up beneath a blanket of gray winter clouds. I had spent the last 48 hours oscillating between residual physical illness and a burning, hyper-focused adrenaline. Today, however, my chest felt clear. The fever was entirely gone, replaced by the absolute, unshakable certainty of a woman who had done the math and knew exactly how the equation would end. I walked into the main boardroom. It was a formidable space, designed to intimidate, featuring a massive, polished mahogany table that stretched across the room, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. The walls were lined with heavy legal volumes, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of the city's frozen skyline. Nalan was already seated at the head of the table, impeccably dressed in a dark navy suit, calmly arranging 5 identical, thick manila folders in front of him. Good morning, Sophia, Nalan said, his voice a low, soothing rumble that betrayed none of the predatory legal instinct he possessed. Are we ready? I am entirely ready, Nalan, I replied, taking the seat immediately to his right. I placed my hands flat on the cool wood of the table, grounding myself. I was no longer the devoted daughter who baked Christmas pies or the frantic victim thrown out into the snow. I was the underwriter. I was the arbiter of risk. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. My father, Wesley, walked in first. He looked terrible. His face was drawn, his skin carrying a grayish pallor, and the tailored wool coat he wore seemed entirely too large for his frame, as if he had shrunk overnight under the weight of his stress. Behind him was David, the attorney Brenda had hired. David carried a thick leather briefcase and wore an expression of aggressive impatience, the look of a man who believed he was walking into a simple negotiation with a disgruntled, emotional family member. And finally, there was Brenda. She had dressed for the part of the wounded victim with theatrical precision. Gone were the flashy designer labels and the aggressive, heavy makeup she usually favored. Instead, she wore a simple, muted beige cashmere sweater, her hair pulled back in a demure, conservative clasp. She looked small, fragile, and utterly harmless. If I hadn't spent the weekend mapping out her history of financial destruction, I might have almost believed the performance. They took their seats across from us. The air in the room was thick, suffocatingly tense. Wesley wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the polished surface of the table, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were white. David didn't waste a single second. He unlatched his briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap and pulled out a stack of documents. "Let's get straight to the point," David began, his voice projecting across the room with practiced authority. "My clients are currently facing a $50,000 penalty for a breach of contract that was maliciously triggered by your client. Sophia deliberately sabotaged a legally binding real estate transaction out of personal spite. We are here to demand the immediate release of the $150,000 in earnest money back into the escrow account, or we will file a civil suit for tortious interference before the courts close today." Nolan didn't even blink. He didn't raise his voice. He simply rested his forearms on the table and leaned forward slightly. "David, I highly recommend you lower your voice and check your hubris," Nolan said smoothly. "My client did not sabotage anything. The purchase contract, which I personally reviewed and which your client, Wesley, willingly signed, explicitly stated that the funding was contingent upon Sophia's active participation as the primary financial guarantor. On the morning of December 25th, your client submitted a formal request to the brokerage to sever Sophia from the documentation. He pulled the pin on the grenade. The fact that he didn't understand the explosion would follow is not my client's legal burden." Brenda let out a soft, trembling sigh, reaching out to place a comforting hand over Wesley's tightly clenched fists. "Sophia, please," Brenda whispered, her voice cracking perfectly on the last syllable, projecting a masterclass in synthetic empathy. "Can't we just put this anger aside? I know you feel replaced. I know you're hurting. But you are destroying your father's financial future over a simple misunderstanding. We are a family. We should act like one." I looked directly at her. I didn't feel anger anymore. I just felt a cold, surgical precision. "We are not a family, Brenda," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a diamond across glass. "We are opposing parties in a financial dispute, and you have never had the slightest interest in my father's future. You are only interested in his present liquidity." I turned to Nolan and gave him a single, subtle nod. Nolan slid the first thick manila folder across the smooth mahogany table until it bumped gently against David's briefcase. "David, I suggest you open that file. Turn to page 4, please. I want you to review the documents before you continue threatening my client with tortious interference." David frowned, his aggressive posture faltering slightly at Nolan's supreme confidence. He opened the folder. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and absolute, broken only by the sharp rustle of thick paper as David flipped to the designated page. "What you are looking at, David," I began, my voice steady and unwavering, "is a certified bankruptcy filing from the state of Nevada, dated 6 years ago. The filer's name is Brenda Elaine Carmichael. It details the systematic liquidation of over $200,000 in marital assets, hidden from a former spouse through a series of shell LLCs registered as fake art consulting firms." David stopped reading. His eyes darted from the paper to Brenda, a flicker of genuine alarm crossing his face. Lawyers, above all else, despise being lied to by their own clients. It leaves them exposed, vulnerable, and professionally compromised. "That's a lie," Brenda stammered, the fragile victim persona cracking instantly. She pulled her hand away from Wesley's and sat up straight. "That was my ex-husband's fault. He was abusive. He hid that money, and I took the fall to escape him. You have no idea what you're talking about, Sophia." "Then let's talk about Arizona," I countered, leaning forward, my eyes locked relentlessly onto hers. I slid the second folder across the table directly toward my father. "Dad, open the folder. Go to page 12. Wesley hesitated, his hands trembling violently as he reached for the manila cover. He opened it slowly, as if he knew whatever was inside was going to shatter his world. That is a sworn, notarized affidavit from a civil court in Maricopa County, Arizona, filed exactly 36 months ago. I recited from memory, the facts etched permanently into my mind. The plaintiff is an 81-year-old widower named Richard Evans. The affidavit details how a woman posing as a high-end art curator befriended him, isolated him from his adult children, convinced him to invest his life savings into a fictitious gallery, and then drained his accounts of nearly $400,000 before vanishing. I watched my father's eyes scan the page. I watched the color completely drain from his already pale face. "Look at the photograph attached to the police report on page 14, Dad," I commanded gently but firmly. Wesley turned the page. He stared at the glossy printed photo. A strangled, breathless sound escaped his throat. It was a surveillance still from an Arizona bank, clearly showing Brenda cashing a cashier's check. This isn't possible," Wesley whispered, his voice shattering in the quiet room. He looked up at Brenda, his eyes wide with a horrifying, desperate confusion. "Brenda, you told me you were living in Paris 3 years ago. You told me you were studying at the Louvre." Brenda's breathing became erratic. The calm, composed facade was entirely gone. She looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting between David, Nolan, and the damning documents on the table. "They fabricated this, Wesley." She shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass walls. "She's a financial underwriter. She knows how to fake paperwork. She paid someone to make this up because she can't stand the fact that you love me more than you love her. She's a jealous, psychotic brat." "Careful, Brenda," Nolan warned, his voice dangerously low. "Slander on the record in a law firm is a bold strategy." David closed his folder with a heavy, definitive thud. He pushed his chair back slightly from the table, physically distancing himself from Brenda. "Brenda," David said, his voice cold and strictly professional. "You explicitly told me during our intake meeting that you had no prior civil judgments, no bankruptcies, and no history of financial litigation. You lied to me to secure my representation. Do your job and defend me." Brenda screamed at David, completely losing her composure. She slammed her perfectly manicured hands down on the mahogany table. "I am paying you to fix this." "Actually, my father is paying him," I corrected quietly. "Or he was." Wesley slowly raised his head. The confusion in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a profound, devastating clarity. The illusion he had so desperately clung to, the illusion of a fresh start, of youthful romance, of being desired, was dead. He looked at the woman sitting next to him, truly seeing her for the first time. He didn't see a sophisticated art consultant. He saw the parasite that had nearly consumed him. "The dates," Wesley murmured, his voice hollow and thick with unshed tears. "The dates on this Nevada filing. They line up exactly with the weeks you asked me for those emergency loans to cover your gallery's shipping costs. The loans you said you'd pay back once the house closed." "Wesley, baby, listen to me." Brenda tried, reaching for his arm again, her voice morphing back into a desperate, pleading whine. Wesley recoiled as if she had burned him. He stood up so quickly his heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He looked down at Brenda, his chest heaving, his face contorted with a mixture of rage, shame, and absolute disgust. "Don't you ever touch me again," Wesley said, his voice shaking with a quiet, terrifying fury. He turned his attention to his lawyer. "David, you are fired, or rather she is fired. I am officially retaining you, exclusively to extricate me from this real estate disaster. Brenda is no longer your client, and I will not pay a single cent of her legal fees moving forward." Brenda's face twisted into an ugly, hateful sneer. The mask had completely melted away, revealing the pure, venomous resentment underneath. "You pathetic, broke old man," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You couldn't afford that house anyway. You're nothing without your daughter's permission. You're a weak, helpless dependent, and you always will be." Wesley didn't argue. He didn't yell. He simply looked at her with overwhelming pity. "Get out," he commanded softly. "Get out of my sight before I ask Nolan to call the police." Brenda grabbed her designer handbag, her face flushed dark red with fury and humiliation. She shot me one final, venomous glare, but I didn't look away. I held her gaze with the absolute, unyielding calm of a woman who had won. She spun on her heel and stormed out of the boardroom, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind her with a definitive, echoing finality. The silence that settled over the boardroom after Brenda's departure was heavy, not with tension, but with the exhausting, breathless aftermath of a major storm. David cleared his throat awkwardly, loosening his silk tie. He looked at Wesley, then at Nolan. "Well," David said, his professional arrogance entirely deflated, "this significantly changes our posture." However, Wesley is still legally bound to the broken contract with the sellers. We are still facing a massive penalty. Nolan folded his hands neatly on the table. "Actually, David, I believe we have a highly advantageous negotiating position. Given that the modifications to the contract were initiated under the fraudulent manipulation of a third party. A third party whose documented history of elder financial abuse I will be personally forwarding to the district attorney's office this afternoon. I am confident the sellers will prefer to settle for a fraction of the penalty rather than have their property tied up in a protracted criminal fraud investigation." David nodded slowly, a look of profound relief washing over his face. "I agree. I will contact their representation immediately." David packed his briefcase and excused himself, leaving just the three of us in the quiet room. Wesley remained standing. He looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the gray city below, his shoulders slumped, the reality of his near ruin crashing down on him. Slowly, he turned to face me. He looked broken. Stripped of his pride, stripped of his delusions, he was just an aging, grieving man who had made a terrible, nearly fatal mistake. "Sophia," he whispered, his voice cracking. Tears finally spilled over his lower lids, tracking down his weathered cheeks. "I am so sorry. I am so deeply, incredibly sorry. I was so afraid of being alone after your mother died. I let that fear make me blind. I threw away the only person who actually cared about me. I threw you out in the cold. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it." I looked at my father. I saw the shame radiating from him, thick and palpable. For 5 years, I had carried him. I had protected him from the world, and in doing so, I had inadvertently made him vulnerable to the exact kind of predator Brenda was. I stood up from my chair and walked slowly around the massive table. I didn't offer a platitude. I didn't tell him it was okay, because it wasn't. What he did was cruel and reckless. But as I stood in front of him, looking into his tear-filled eyes, I felt the last lingering shards of my anger dissolve, replaced by a profound, quiet peace. "I love you, Dad," I said softly, reaching out to gently grasp his trembling hands. "And I forgive you, but things have to change. I cannot be your financial manager anymore. I cannot be the parent in this relationship. You have to rebuild your own foundation. You have to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet without me holding you up and without someone like Brenda tearing you down." Wesley nodded vigorously, gripping my hands like a lifeline. "I will. I promise you, Sophia, I will go to therapy. I'll take a financial literacy course for seniors. Whatever it takes, I just want my daughter back." "I'm right here," I smiled, a genuine healing warmth finally blooming in my chest. "Let's go home." The aftermath unfolded rapidly in the weeks that followed. True to Nolan's prediction, the sellers of the grand estate, horrified by the revelation of Brenda's fraud, agreed to void the contract for a negligible administrative fee, allowing Wesley to walk away without financial ruin. My earnest money remained securely in my trust. Brenda, however, did not walk away. Nolan kept his word. He forwarded our meticulously compiled dossier to the district attorney's elder fraud division. The overwhelming evidence we had gathered provided the exact ammunition the authorities needed. Within a month, Brenda was formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and financial exploitation, not just in our state, but federal warrants were issued based on her history across state lines. Her days of masquerading as a high society art consultant were permanently over. As for me, I finally moved into my own apartment. It was smaller than my father's house, but it was entirely mine. I decorated it the way I wanted. I spent my evenings reading, rather than balancing someone else's checkbook. My father and I started having dinner together once a week, not as a manager and a dependent, but simply as a father and a daughter, slowly and honestly rebuilding the bridge between us. I had faced the ultimate betrayal. I had survived the storm, and I had emerged on the other side stronger, unburdened, and entirely at peace.